Hello, BookTube, and welcome to May, and that means maybe Midrash. That's a BookTube event, the brainchild of Jason over at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, designed to examine and maybe in some cases celebrate the interweaving of religion, of sacred thought of all kinds, with literature of all kinds. Doesn't have to be Christianity, and it doesn't have to be favorable. And I already announced for this channel what I'd be doing. I picked a couple of books. I'm going to do a read-along for one half of the month of fiction and then a read-along for the second half of the month of nonfiction. And the fiction that we're reading now, this will be the first of those videos. The fiction that we're reading for the beginning of Maybe Midrash is Joseph Heller's 1984 novel, God Knows. Joseph Heller was one of a small cadre of authors of fiction in the course of the 20th century who was really sort of hamstrung, although he would never admit it, by the debut novel, by the first book. The first book to launch to public attention in this author's case was his weakest book. Catch-22 is a very, very smart book built on a gimmick, whereas all the rest of what he wrote is great. His contemporary novels, Good as Gold, for instance, they're amazingly good. They're completely forgotten. They're completely overlooked. Now, that is common to these authors, to mid-20th century authors. It tends to be true, not in all cases. The cohort of which Joseph Heller was a member features, for instance, Kurt Vonnegut, who never wrote anything good. It features Norman Mailer, whose first book is his best book. So in that case, it's justified. It features Philip Roth, who, in my opinion, never wrote anything good that was fiction. But it also features people like John O'Hara, for whom you could make a case that the early success did him in, and a bunch of others who have more or less faded. For instance, no one remembers John Barth now, even though I believe he's still alive. And John Gardner, who had a whole career of big, meaty, wonderful novels and literary projects, is now mainly remembered for the one book he wrote that was small enough to be taught in schools, Grendel. God Knows is a perfect example of this for Joseph Heller. He is remembered for Catch-22. He is synonymous with Catch-22, but God Knows has 10 times the wisdom, 10 times the literary ability, 10 times the refined sense of humor, although in this author, sense of humor is never really very refined. You have to keep in mind that although this book was not written at the heyday of the phallocentric American cadre of literary lions, of which John Updike and Norman Mailer and Philip Roth are still the standard bearers. Although it wasn't written in that heyday, it was very much written in that mind frame. Once this group of eternal boys got that mind frame into their head, they never really got it out of their heads. So the humor that runs throughout this book can often be of that type. It can very often be of the penthouse type. And if you have maybe read the first half of this book for this read-along, I'm not actually expecting that for maybe Midrash. I'm mainly going to just talk about these things rather than expect a read-along. But if you have, you will have noticed that already. That this is not a conventional historical novel. The book is about King David, who has one of the greatest stories in the Hebrew Bible. It's an incredible, incredible tale. And it's been written many, many times by many, many authors, many, many novelists. Two of the more famous examples that go alongside this one would be King of Kings by Malachi Martin, but also David the King by Gladys Schmidt, who is now forgotten, unfortunately. She wrote a roster of really good stuff, but she is totally forgotten. David the King is a very worthy book. And there have been others, lots of others, but you can tell right away, you can tell on the first page of this, that this isn't going to be anything like them. That this is a taste, a tiny bit of magical realism runs throughout this book. Joe Heller's King David knows, for instance, that he is King David. He knows that he's in the Bible. He knows that Michelangelo made a statue of him. He knows all that stuff. He has a kind of meta-awareness. He breaks the fourth wall of the novel. It's still a historical novel, very much. Joseph Heller did a small amount of research for this book, but his David is a queasy amalgamation of himself and a couple of other people who are readily identifiable the more you know about this author's life. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, now that I've got the camera on and I'm not researching, I'm trying to remember if Joseph Heller has ever had a really good literary biography. I'm not sure. I've read one, but it wasn't any good, and I'm not sure that he ever has had one. maybe he wouldn't warrant one or sustain one. Unfortunately, he is an example of someone who was a bit spoiled by success, maybe more than a bit spoiled by success. He was, in person, not quite as repellent as, for instance, Mel Brooks, but getting there. Definitely getting there. He didn't have any kind of thing in his life, any kind of quality in his life to leaven that process, the way, for instance, William Styron did. So, and this, as you can tell, I have a kind of fascination with the male authors of what we could call the high 20th century. I have a kind of fascination with them and the things they did, and my fascination is largely born by the fact that I hate so many of them. But there are quite a few of them that I love. John Gardner, I think his fiction is fantastic from start to finish. Same thing is true with Joe Heller, and God Knows is my favorite book of his. I shouldn't say that his fiction is good from start to finish, because he tried to write a sequel to Catch-22. Anyway, this is the story of King David as told by King David, and knowing that he's King David, knowing that he's in the Bible. So there's a meta element that is handled, I think, very, very well. And you get right away the kind of wry humor that you're going to get throughout this book. But this is not primarily a funny book. It has very funny parts in it, very funny, especially David's characterizations of his multiple wives. But it has also running through it the thing that I think saves it, the thing that I think lifts it above anything else that this author ever wrote, is an absolutely piercing, ice-cold thread of sorrow, of disillusioned sorrow that runs throughout this book. David is a king who once talked with God regularly and who doesn't talk with God anymore, and God doesn't talk to him. They are on the outs. They are friends who are now enemies over a dead baby. And we get allusions to that right at the beginning, right in the first few pages of the book. And those allusions keep coming, and they keep building. It's all very skillfully done. The research, I don't know, but the Joseph Heller knew how to construct a novel in a really skillful way, went over it, worked over it. And that works here. And that's a good thing, too, because whether Joseph Heller was thinking about it or not, this novel is going out now. I don't know if God Knows is still in print. I have no idea. But if it is, or if you find it at a yard sale or whether, it's going out now to an audience that does not know David's story. They're not going to have any idea. When a dead baby is mentioned, they're not going to have any idea what that means. They might have heard the name Bathsheba, but they're not going to know anything about it. They will definitely know the one thing about King David that anybody knows is David and Goliath. Because that term, that phrase has entered the lexicon as a normal thing to say when talking about a tiny opponent against someone who is apparently easily able to win. And Joseph Heller knows perfectly well that he has to get to that story and that he has to talk about it. I think it's a testament to his, I don't want to say his unwillingness to sell out, because he had that in abundance, but he had also a kind of fierce independence as a writer. He knew when he started this book, when he started plotting it and then weaving it and revising it, he knew perfectly well that all eyes would be on his version of the Goliath story. Because every critic in New York who might not know anything else about King David knows that story. Whether they know that David danced naked before the Lord or of the Psalms or anything like that, they definitely know that story. And I want to get you to that story. That is part of we're reading the first half of this book for the first day of maybe Midrash, and then next weekend we'll finish it up. And I wanted to read you a bit of that part, just to see what you make of it, in case you haven't got to it yet. This is David telling us the story of Goliath. It's a bit long, but it shows you a lot of what Joseph Heller can do and what he can't do. If you want to believe what you've heard, I halted along the way to choose 5 smooth stones out of the brook. That was just for show. Any slinger worth his salt always carries his stones with him. And as I knelt with my knees in the water, I was unobtrusively removing 2 from the leather pouch at my waist, concealing them in the palm of my right hand. 2 would certainly be enough. If I didn't disable the big warrior with my first shot, I probably wouldn't have time even for a second. As I rose and crossed the shallow stream, I transferred my shepherd's staff to my left hand. Goliath did not appear to notice. I had to suppress a smile. With my right hand, I stealthily began unfastening the cords of my sling from my belt and clearing the loops. Let's call him a giant. His teeth, not Bathsheba's, were like a flock of sheep that have been evenly shorn. Now, see, that's an echo of a psalm. You won't know that if you're not biblically literate, and most of the 21st century is not. So, but anyway, with her it was mere flattery, but with Goliath everything was larger than life. I have to chortle even now at the violent transformations he underwent when it finally began to dawn on him why I was there. How his eyes bulged with amazement, how his massive face darkened with outrage and purpled with wrath, how he howled and roared when he finally recovered from his initial moment of shock. You'd think he'd been speared in the liver. For 40 days he had asked the Israelites that they send down a man worthy to engage a Philistine champion of his mettle in single combat. Instead, he'd been given a youthful shepherd who was ruddy and of fair countenance. He had expected Achilles. He'd been given me. And on top of it all, I was carrying a stick. Doubts that I could kill him continued to evaporate as he allowed me to draw closer and closer without arming himself, and I observed the sequence of responses with which he observed me. He was befuddled, he was curious, he was aghast, and then, oh boy, was that an angry giant. It amuses me still to recall his blackening expression of astounded disbelief when my objective in approaching him began to sink in. He gaped, and he glared, and he stood rooted to the spot as though paralyzed. Am I a dog? He raged, and drew another large breath to rage some more. Feigning deafness, I interrupted him. What? I called in reply. I slipped the larger of my 2 stones into the hollow of my sling, which now was free and held furtively against my thigh. Am I a dog? I said, he bellowed with annoyance. Are you deaf or something? Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? As I moved steadily toward him, he began to curse me by his gods, by Dagon and Moloch, by Baal and Belial. Oh, what a mouth there was on that giant. Come to me, come on, come on. He was moving both arms now, rapidly beckoning me to come to him. And I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. What? I again pretended I hadn't heard. He repeated his threat verbatim, as barefoot I slid closer and closer to him. Now he was addressing himself only to me. This time I chose to answer. You'll give my flesh unto the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field, I replied, with an insulted passion of my own. I'll give you flesh. I'll show you who'll give whose flesh. I'll give you your flesh unto the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field. Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. Where is the shield? He sneered, and raised his hands to display them empty. Where's my spear? Where's my sword? But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, I proceeded, without answering his questions, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. My voice was filled with righteousness. Ask me to this day what I thought I was talking about when I said Lord of hosts, and I still won't be able to tell you. I have many phrases whose meaning is likewise unintelligible even to me, but rhetoric is rhetoric. This day will the Lord deliver thee into my hand, I informed him gamely, and I will smite thee and take thy head from thee, and I will give the carcass of the host of the Philippines this day unto the fowls of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you unto our hands. Now, quite frankly, this doesn't sound like, to me, like anything I would have said under normal circumstances, although back then, the underlying sentiment might have been mine. Those were my salad days, when I was green in judgment, and I believed in a great number of things about which I'm skeptical now. I believed in the future. I still believed in God. I even believed in Saul. I've had 3 fathers in my life, Jesse, Saul, and God. All 3 have disappointed me. And I have lived without God a long time now, and probably I can learn to die without him too. And the story goes on. Of course, the moment comes, and it's not a big deal. But notice that even in the peak of remembering this key moment, this particular version of David can't get over his bitterness and his heartache. You come back to the notion of God many, many times, including devastatingly at the end of this book. But all the rest of it is here. Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite and Jonathan, who David loved with a passion surpassing that of women, and Goliath, and of course Mad King Saul, and David becoming king. It's dealt with wonderfully, more so here than in any other David treatment. And I've read quite a few of them, including some that were indie publications that did not get the audience they deserved. We're going to continue. I'm not going to belabor this because I don't know how many of you are actually reading this. I have had a joy rereading this for maybe Midrash. And we're going to talk about it again next weekend. Next Sunday, we'll finish up God Knows by Joseph Heller, and I'll have a lot more to say. But that is the basic opening premise, is that we're getting a world-weary, cynical, heartbroken, and entirely modern David. This is not a straightforward historical novel in the sense that maybe somebody who knew nothing about Joseph Heller might have been expecting. And one note to part with is that it's a very modern version, a very postmodern version almost. There, to my knowledge, there was never before this a King David novel in which God is silent. He might have been a delusion, or he might have been a private voice, but it was never in previous David novels, and as far as I know, in every David novel since this, even the ones that are relatively secular, that aren't written by religious authors with an intent of religious proselytization, even those don't give us a David who is a modern man for whom God is silent and might be the object of some resentment. That took some chutzpah. And this book is full of that particular quality of the chosen people, and we'll get into more of it next week. So I will wrap this up for now, and I will be back, and I encourage you to look at all the rest of maybe Midrash. There are all sorts of people joining in here, and it's going to be a lot of fun, because like it or not, most of us, even if we're raised secular, still have some religion as a huge part of our life. So this is a quintessentially good Jason idea. I don't always agree with some of his other ideas. Someday he will make the long trek to Boston, and he and I will have a long 9-round, no-holds-barred Duke Fest on President Obama, on the subject of President Obama. And it'll be great because we're friends. So we'll be able to pull out all the stops for your amusement. We'll certainly film it. But for now, I encourage you to check out all the rest of the Maybe Midrash videos, because they're going to be great fun. So I'll wrap this up, and we'll return to God Knows next weekend. Thank you, BookTube.